Good morning, Grace and friends. Today's sermon is called Apprentices of Jesus. The first thing Jesus did, not second or third, the first thing after his baptism and his testing in the wilderness was to call some disciples. Even God and Jesus need disciples. Matthew's gospel is preeminently a training manual for disciples. So I've called this series of sermons based on Matthew a field guide for befuddled followers of Jesus. Some ministers and churches these days like to say we're not a membership organization, we are a discipleship organization. So good so far, but what does disciple mean? Dallas Willard, as I will talk about later, likes the word apprentice for disciple. That's a good start on our exploration. Our text for today are two stories of Jesus' calling of his first disciples. Let's take a look. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is going along the Sea of Galilee when he sees Simon, whom he will later nickname Peter, and his brother Andrew throwing their net into the sea. "Follow me," he said to them. Following Jesus is a key meaning of what it does mean to be a disciple. "Follow me," he said, "and I will make you fishers of people." The image is of Jesus and his disciples casting nets together to haul people in who were drowning in the sea. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, we used to sing. Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. There are all kinds of ways of perishing and all kinds of ways Jesus comes to save. Now we get to be by Jesus' side, casting our nets. Sometimes it has been we ourselves who have been hauled into safety. The text says that Peter and Andrew immediately left their nets to follow him. Was this day the first time they had seen or heard of him? Perhaps they had heard him and seen him and been drawn to him before he came to them that day. However, whenever, wherever Jesus calls us to follow, there's an immediacy to it, a right nowness to it. Then Jesus saw James and John, the sons of Zebedee, fishing. They were also called the sons of thunder. Sue calls them James and John Thunderson. Jesus called them, and they too immediately left their nets to follow. Now let's go to Luke's story of the calling of the disciples. Jesus was teaching by the sea, and he spied two boats belonging to Peter and Andrew and James and John. They were on the shore washing their nets. He climbed into one of their boats. When Jesus comes, he climbs into our boats. Then he said, "Put out into the deep and let your nets out for a catch." We need to get out of the shallows if we're to help people in trouble. We need to get out of the shallows to learn what it means to follow Jesus. You may remember Kenny Stabler, the gunslinger of a quarterback for the Oakland Raiders, who was inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame. When he was inducted, he gave these two words of advice: go deep. So also Jesus. Someone has quipped, all the noise is in the shallow end of the pool. That may pertain to our spirituality as well. It is in the depths where we discover God. It's in the depths where we discover our own true selves. God is not just up there or out there. God is in here, down in our depths. The psalmist wrote, "Some go down to the sea in ships, plying their trade in the mighty waters. They have seen the works of the Lord and God's wonders in the deep." Followers of Jesus don't stay in the shallows, and his churches don't stay safe in the harbor. Now to this word apprentice. Dallas Willard, in his book, The Divine Conspiracy, offers us the word apprentice for disciple. An apprentice, he writes, is someone who has decided to be with another person under appropriate conditions in order to become capable of doing what that person does or being what that person is. The word apprentice reminds us that there's a master from whom we learn. It implies it will take time, that there will be trial and error, success and failures as we learn. Anne Lamott writes that sometimes her thoughts would make Jesus want to drink gin straight from the cat dish. But she loves Jesus and he loves her. And the word reminds us that our apprenticeship is not only about doing, but about being. It's about the kind of person Jesus is teaching us to be. Learn of me, Jesus said, not just from me, but of me. In the Suzuki method of violin teaching, which sometimes starts with children at 3 or 4, it's not just about learning how to hold the bow or make some notes. It's about a whole way of living your life. So much more so with Jesus. He is our master, our mentor, our teacher, teaching us not only a skill, but how to live. Well, what are the appropriate conditions Willard talks about under which we can be apprentices of Jesus? I think it begins with dwelling in Jesus' words and teachings and letting them dwell in us. We let them in and have their way with us. We take time with them. A philosopher said that his first words to budding philosophers is take time. Take time, not just in a chronological sense, but also in the sense of taking time to sit still, letting Jesus' words and teachings sink in to our deepest parts of ourselves. Disciple literally means learner, and we get to be lifetime learners of Jesus. The poet Rilke describes knowledge as inexhaustible pleasure. So learning of Jesus can be. Another appropriate condition is to learn of Jesus in the company of those who are trying to do the same. Few do it better alone. We help each other in our understanding of who Jesus is and what it means to be his follower. In church, we get to do so regularly. This circle of learning also includes the stories and writings of those who have been through 2,000 years in the search for who Jesus is and how to be his disciple. Do we decide for Jesus once and for all, or all along the way? Jürgen Moltmann, one of the great theologians of our time, was conscripted as a young man into Hitler's army. He became a Christian in a Scottish prisoner of war camp. The chaplain there gave him a copy of the New Testament Gospels and the Psalms. As he read them, as he took time with them, he became a follower of Jesus. But that was not the end and all of it. In his autobiography, he wrote, "I have never decided for Christ once and for all, as is often demanded of us. I have decided again and again in specific terms for the discipleship of Christ when situations were serious and it was necessary. But right down to the present day, almost 60 years later, I am certain that then in 1941, and there in the Scottish prisoner of war camp, in the dark pit of my soul, Jesus sought me and found me." This resonates with me in deciding for Christ both in little and larger ways. Will I strike back? Will I tell the truth? Will I stand by God's little ones? There was an early morning in Fort Worth many years ago when my drowsy first waking consciousness, in my first drowsy waking consciousness, I heard a voice saying, "Go join Michael." Here's the story. Michael Bell was a black clergy friend. He had begun with a few other black ministers in an early morning protest at an elementary school in an affluent part of town. They were addressing the inequities in the school system between white children and black and Hispanic children. The parents at the elementary school were not happy to be met by this group of protesters as they brought their children to school. Some of those parents were in my church. That morning, out of the blue, came the words into my mind, "Go join Michael." I slipped on my suit and tie, went down the street, and joined them. Was the voice I heard that early morning the voice of Christ? The voice of conscience? Or was it, as Scrooge said to the ghost of Jacob Marley, merely a bit of undigested potato? Well, such a prompting had never happened before. I am no hero here. I wonder how many times I have not been sensitive to such promptings, much less followed them. But that day, as Moltmann put it, I decided for the discipleship of Jesus. The revered Episcopal priest Samuel Shoemaker, no relation, writes that when we become a Christian, we give as much of ourselves as we can to as much of Christ as we know. Then the adventure of discipleship begins, discovering more and more of ourselves to give and more of Christ to give ourselves to. There is a beginning and then a deciding over and over for Christ. What does it mean to be a Christian, a disciple, a follower of Jesus? I love how Wendell Berry answered when Bill Moyers in his PBS show asked near the end of his interview, "Do you still consider yourself a Christian? Berry answered, "I consider myself a person who takes the Gospels very seriously, and I read in them, and I'm shamed by them, and sometimes utterly baffled by them. But there's a good bit of the gospel that I do think I get. I believe I understand it correctly, and I'm sticking to that, and I'm hanging on for the parts I don't understand, and, willing to endure the shame of falling short as a price of admission." That sounds like a disciple to me. The learning, the successes, the failures, the bafflement, the everyday challenge and learning and joy of following Jesus. Amen.